So how do we measure coping? Well, I just want to talk about this briefly. We pretty much always measure coping via self-report. Now how we do that, it can vary, and in case any of you are wondering, I have actually posted some freely available coping measures on our course website. One's a website link and one is actual link to a PDF. And that way you can see how we go about in research trying to measure coping. The problem is all of the measures are in fact self-report, and we don't all have great insight into how we cope with situations. The other thing is, we might get at coping in different ways. Sometimes researchers will provide a pretend or a hypothetical situation and ask the person, how do you cope with this event? In that case, well, it might just not be ecologically valid, meaning it might not relate well enough to any experience we can ever imagine happening. And so I might say, sure, I'd cope in X way, but would that actually happen if I could really truly imagine that situation? Maybe or maybe not, so it might not apply to real life. The other problem is it's subject to memory effects. You might ask me, how did I cope with a recent stressful situation, but my memory is not going to be perfect. And we know that when under stress, our memory is even worse. And so it's really subject to self-report biases, which are subject to memory biases and troubles in coding. And so basically, what I'm trying to say here is coping is really hard to measure accurately. So, what are the take-home conclusions? Your book does a nice job at outlining these, so I thought we'd go over them. Coping is flexible, variable, requires balance, repertoire, and it's the mediator, never the outcome, the process. So, variable. What I mean by that is it varies within the individual. So how I cope with something is going to vary within me depending on the situation. And then it also varies across individuals. How I cope with something and you cope with the very same thing might be different. Coping is flexible. We need to have specific strategies, and those strategies that we use are going to vary in how adaptive they are, depending on the type and attribute of the stressor. And we have to be prepared to throw any of the strategies we have at that stressor. Furthermore, what works for me today, managing X situation, might not work for me in 20 years, managing pretty much the same situation, so we have to be flexible. Balance. The effectiveness of coping depends on there being a good fit between the person, the environment, and what resources we have in the environment, and the strategy chosen. Repertoire. We need a wide range of strategies to adapt most effectively. And this again comes back to what resources do I have personally in my environment, and will that strategy work? So if my go-to response is always to call my best friend on her cell phone when something stressful happens, what am I going to do when that best friend is out of the country and out of cell phone service? I'm going to have some other strategies available to me if I'm going to be able to cope effectively. And finally, coping is a mediator, never the outcome. So coping strategies are always the process. Remember, it's the road that's traveled, it's not the destination. All right, please let me know if you have any questions, and don't forget to look at Chapter 2, which is also assigned for this week.